All right, we're back, and let's talk about Constantine and Constantinople. Let's go to the rise of the East Roman Empire. Who was Constantine? Tell me about his rise to power and the founding of Constantinople in 330 AD.
Sure. So Constantine was the son of one of Diocletian's colleagues. So he comes from within the system. And the system was actually designed to be non-hereditary. In other words, the senior emperors would retire, the junior ones would move up to the senior position, and then they would recruit two new ones.
Mm-hmm.
And they tried to skip the dynastics element. So it would be kind of, let's just say, kind of meritocratic, not whose son, you were. Constantine was a son. He was passed over, but the armies liked him. He was actually quite competent.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a series of civil wars among all of these successors of Diocletian, and Constantine emerges as the winner. There are periods when there are quite a few of them. They're like 6 at a time, but they gradually winnow down to 1. So as long as you have the quarterfinals, semifinals, and then the final war, and Constantine emerges in 324 as the sole ruler of the entire Roman Empire. So that's who he is. He's definitely an insider, very, very competent general at civil war. And he gradually moves eastward. So as he's conquering his rivals, who are often at times his father-in-laws or his brother-in-laws, but because these people are all intermarry and they have alliances and they fall out, it's one of those kinds of situations. He moves eastward, and by the time he defeats his last rival, this an emperor called Licinius, in 324, he's in the east, and Licinius had his headquarters, or one of his headquarters, at this town called Byzantium. Byzantium is a city right where Constantinople was founded,
Mm-hmm.
and it is at exactly the point where Europe meets Asia, so on the Bosporus. And it's a very strategic location. It always had been, right? So whoever controls the Straits of the Bosporus, we don't need to explain how important that is. And Constantine decides to create a city named after himself, Constantinople, on that spot, Byzantium. So Byzantium essentially ceases to exist as a city and is replaced by Constantinople, aka New Rome. So it's pretty clear that right from the beginning, Constantine intended this to be a kind of branch office of Rome in the East, a kind of copy and paste of Rome in the East, and it's a plan that his successors continued, right? Now, there are a number of other cities in this, let's say in the generation or two before this, that were also treated as sort of quasi-Romes. Basically, there was this historian in the 3rd century who said, well, wherever the emperor is, that's Rome. Right? Because emperors are now itinerant. They're no longer staying at Rome. They're mostly on the frontier. And Constantine is one of these frontier emperors. They will sometimes visit Rome, maybe once or twice, maybe once a decade, something like this. So Rome becomes something that can be sort of copied and pasted in other parts of the empire. And a bunch of other cities get called, a new Rome, an other Rome, an alternative Rome, my Rome. And Constantinople is the last and most successful of those.
So maybe can you speak geographically the importance of Constantinople? It's an interesting place because it. When you're talking about a land so large as the West and the East, with enemies, with threats from all kinds of different directions, the location where the emperor sits is important.
Very. So look at Rome, right? So it's right in the middle of Italy, right in the middle of the Mediterranean. Very safe location in a way, but it's very far from the frontiers. And this is a period when emperors need to be with the armies, right? They're not senatorial emperors who are sitting in Rome having meetings with senators. They are military emperors who are marching along the frontiers, mostly with generals rather than civilian administration. So they're doing their job. Like, this is the hard work. They're slogging through the mud of winter campaigns, right? They're not just sitting in a palace enjoying themselves when they could. But Rome just becomes inconvenient because of that. And if you look at Constantinople, it is kind of halfway between the Danube frontier and the Euphrates frontier. So if you want to prioritize the East or treat it as an equal part of the Roman Empire, as these emperors all did, in fact, almost all emperors who had a choice about whether they would stay in the East or stay in the West chose the East. There's only one who chooses the West, and that's Valentinian later in the 4th century. All the others understand that the East is where it's at. And Constantinople is right between the Danube and the Euphrates. These are two major frontiers. And so it allows emperors to move between the two. And also look at its location north, south, east, west, right? So north, south, it is the node between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, right? And east, west, it's precisely where Europe meets Asia, right? And because there's a break there, so there's a Bosporus, the Sea of Marmara, the Hellespont, the Roman Empire during the civil wars, it would tend to break there.
Mm-hmm.
And you would have one emperor on one side in Asia, and you would have another emperor on the other side. And this just kept happening. And Constantinople ultimately functions as a kind of clamp that unifies this whole area. So basically the Balkans and Asia Minor and Syria as a kind of unit, right? And, what is a new Rome? A new Rome is, among other things, a new Senate, right? And Constantine and his successors recruit this new Senate for the new Rome. So we're talking about maybe 2,500, 3,000 men, at its peak. And these are all recruited from all of these areas. Some come from Rome, but others come from the Aegean region, from Asia Minor, Eastern Mediterranean. So these are the wealthiest people, usually most well-connected elites from the whole Eastern Mediterranean, and they come together and form a new purpose, common purpose, in Constantinople. And the empire never breaks there again, right? So it holds together this part of the world. The breaking point now, interestingly, moves to the Adriatic, right? So when in 395 we talked about East and West kind of splitting, it breaks at the Adriatic, because Constantinople is now holding that whole Eastern world together. Because all of these elites, they're invested in it. They're literally investing in it. They have to invest in it in order to be senators in Constantinople. So that's kind of one of the functions that it performs. A strategic function, there's a political function. There's also a cultural one, but we can talk about that too. But that's what you see there on that map: the northwest, east, south.
So just to linger on it, so you do a podcast, Byzantine and Friends, but you're also a guest on podcasts, and I should mention you being a guest multiple times on the History of Byzantium podcast, hosted by Robin Pearson. I highly recommend people listen to it, to all of your appearances. You have a lot of really fascinating ones. But the reason I bring all of that up is one of the episodes you do the fun thing of selecting the top 10 emperors of Byzantium. And spoiler alert, everybody should go listen to the full list because you justify all the different options.
Yeah.
But Constantine ends up in the number one spot.
Yeah.
And so can you just add a little bit more depth why he would be in your number one spot now that we're talking about him?
Yes. It's not because I sort of like him as a person, right? I mean, as you said, he was pretty murderous.
Yeah.
Right? All those wars. So clearly ambitious, murderous, ruthless, basically.
Can you actually speak to the murderous aspect? He seemed to have murdered a lot of people in his family.
Yes, that's because what we call his family were also alliances of convenience that he made on the way to the top. And when those alliances or, those wives or those fathers-in-law were no longer convenient or turned against him, he had no hesitation in removing them. But he's also, he gets a little extra bonus because he also murdered his own son, Crispus, who was apparently a very competent and popular kind of general, and we don't know why. Mm-hmm. He executes Crispus soon after defeating Licinius, and then follows it up with the murder of his wife, not Crispus's mother. And we don't know why. The funny thing is that when emperors do this sort of thing, if there's any kind of remotely like a good reason, they'll blast it through all of the media, right? Like Crispus was rebelling against me or whatever. There's nothing. Yeah. He doesn't even try to justify it, which means it must have been something unjustified. Like, I don't know. I can't process it.
And also I read that there's historians of the time would just ignore that happened.
Yes. Well, sort of. So when Crispus is alive, it's all like praising Crispus as, oh, Constantine, you great emperor, and your wonderful son who will whatever. And then Crispus is executed and he just disappears from the, like, they never talk about him.
Yeah. Actually, as another side to a side, I think you mentioned, whether it's on your podcast or elsewhere, that if you had to have a beer with any of the emperors, that you probably wouldn't. So it's not like some of the most impactful, some of the most influential and great emperors that we talk about, they might not be very pleasant people.
Right. So let's set aside whether you'd like to have a beer with these people. The reason I put Constantine at the top of the list is because the decisions that he made were so consequential, just important, and for the most part, not bad decisions. So I couldn't not put him at the top of the list. The creating Constantinople and converting to Christianity and setting the empire on a path to conversion. These are major, like, world history level decisions, right? Now, not many emperors do that. In fact, Constantine is in, like, his own league when it comes to those kinds of decisions. My other criteria for top emperors were basically those who did the job well, right? Not making, these kinds of shattering decisions or, world history changing decisions, but just who performed the role competently with results that impacted the lives of their subjects for the better. So those are the other criteria that I used. It's difficult to juggle these different criteria, right, in order to create a systematic list. And by the way, we historians generally don't do these kinds of things, but you said it's fun. It is fun.
It was fun.
And it allows you to talk about certain things that you might not otherwise do. So yeah, that's why Constantine was at the top.